Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, a weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the authors, books, and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale, and I'm joined this week by Dr. Benjamin Smith, the lecturer in philosophy. And today we're going to look at the trial and death of Socrates. It's going to be our topic of discussion today. We're going to see what kind of lessons we can learn, some modern lessons from a very ancient event. But before we get started, I want to invite all our listeners, please hit that subscribe button. Please share this content. That really helps us, and everybody knows about all the algorithms and how all these things work. So it really helps us if you share the content with your friends, with your family, with anybody you know, with those people at your parish who are interested. If you've been lucky enough to find those that are interested in philosophy and going deeper in theology, share the content with them, hit that subscribe button and hit the like button. All right, so let's get started. So, Dr. Smith, we're going to talk about the death and trial, or the trial and death of Socrates. Sure. But as we get started here, let's begin with a little bit of background, because I mean, we don't have any writings of Socrates per se. They all come from Plato. So, kind of set the stage for this very traumatic event.
Yeah, it is a traumatic event, actually, and it's interesting that it's a traumatic event that really sort of sets the stage for the development of Western philosophy in general. Socrates is really the paradigmatic figure, right, of Western philosophy. Even if you're not a fan per se of Socrates' doctrines, like, he just does set the example. Like, when you think of a philosopher, you think of a guy with a beard, a long beard, and a toga, or not a toga, but like a Greek robe, right? He really does kind of like set the stage. And a large reason he sets the stage is not only because of his teaching and his example, but really because of his character, I think, and sort of the events of his life. It's remarkable, right? That really, in a lot of ways, even if he wasn't the first Western philosopher, he's considered kind of the father of Western philosophy. But, his life ends in his own execution, right? And it is, in that way, it's traumatic, right? In a lot of ways, I think he's the founder of Western philosophy, and his example is inspiring, the whole tradition. And yet, right, he is executed, right, by his own city. And it's even more remarkable when you think about how famous Socrates is, right? He's probably one of the most famous ancient figures that we have, right?
Yeah.
And he was executed by his own city. So it's a good question, like, well, how did that come about, right? That somebody that's so influential, so famous, was executed by his own city. And I think, in answering that question, we can learn a lot about Socrates, but also about philosophy and the relationship of philosophy to kind of human life in general, but also, the relationship of philosophy to the truth, and the relationship of philosophy to kind of the city, which in the ancient world would have meant like the political community.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, I mean, in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, right? They could have gone back in time and gotten anybody, but they went back and got Socrates, right? So
that's right.
Anyway,
that's right. There you go.
Anyways, all right, let's get to it.
Just like the little bit of background will be helpful in understanding what this trial is. So first, a little bit just kind of historically situating him. Socrates lives in the 5th century BC. So basically, 400 or more years before the birth of Christ. So, definitely in the ancient world, he's if you know anything about Greek history is punctuated by 2 gigantic wars that take place. At the beginning of the 4th century, you have the Greco-Persian Wars. That's where Persia tries to take over Greece. If you watch that miserable movie, The 300, then miserable because it's such a terrible depiction. But anyways, they even got the fighting wrong, but whatever. That movie, The 300, right, is about that period, right? The resistance of the Greeks to being taken over by Persia. If somebody wants to read a better version of that, they should read The Gates of Fire by Stephen Pressfield. It's an excellent book. So sorry, a little plug there. Then the other big war is the Peloponnesian Wars, which is really like the Greek Civil War, right? Where the Greeks fight each other for about 30 years. Roughly, it starts around 431 and goes to about 405, 402, something like that. So Socrates lives from 470 to 399. So he's like born kind of at the tail end of the Greco-Persian Wars, but then lives through the Peloponnesian Wars. And in fact, we know, as a matter of fact, it's really interesting that he fought actually three separate battles during that time, which I think is important, because I think sometimes people have a idea of Socrates isn't accurate. He was actually a pretty manly guy, right? I mean, he fought in 3 battles. He won a commendation for valor in one of the battles. His profession was a stonemason. So this is a strong guy, right? Or a bricklayer. We don't know exactly, but something around those times, around that. He was known to be able to drink everybody under the table without himself ever getting drunk. So, I mean, he's maybe different than what people kind of think, right? In terms of of the philosopher, right?
Yeah, well, especially of Greek philosophers too. You think of, soft hands.
That's
right?
right.
I mean,
That's right. That's interesting. But what's interesting from as far as Socrates' story goes, is during this period we have the transition from an aristocracy to a democracy in Athens, and that's important because eventually the Greek assembly becomes the sovereign power, right, within Athens. And it's really a sovereign assembly. You need to think about Athenian democracy, of course, is quite different than our democracy. There's a huge number of slaves, and of course they can't participate. Women can't participate, that sort of thing. Non-citizens can't participate. So it's actually a large citizen body, but it's not everybody, right? Yeah. But what's really interesting in the assembly is truly sovereign. That is, the assembly can do anything it wants, right? That is, there's no constitutional limits on what the assembly can do. So it is a democracy in the sense of vote taking, right? But there's not a recognition of constitutional rights that limit the assembly, right? It's really interesting, right? So, I mean, sometimes, like if they'll elect a general, for example, that's how they would choose their generals, right? They elect them, right? Yeah. And they would send that general to go on mission. If the general didn't succeed, sometimes they'd execute him, right? You didn't win. Sorry,
fair enough.
You're guilty of losing, right? So this is a really rough and ready kind of situation here, right? Yeah. And you can become, and this is what's important here, you can become very powerful if you could get the assembly on your side, right? You could become very wealthy, very powerful. You could have your enemies, killed, exiled, right? All kinds of things, right? If you could get the assembly on your side. So pretty quickly, people caught on that the best, if you're ambitious and you have the money and the time to commit to politics, then that's a really good avenue for becoming wealthy and powerful in Athens. And so, where there's a demand, there's supply, and this interest, this ambition, sort of helped to foster the growth of a class of people called the Sophist, right? Yeah. Which is interesting, right? The Sophist, the term comes from the same root that we get philosophy, and that's Sophia, right, which means wisdom. But Sophist means wise one, right? So a sophist is a wise one, and what makes him wise is that he can teach you how to be persuasive in the assembly, right? So he's kind of like your first self-help guru, right? Right. How to win friends and influence people kind of guy, right?
It has nothing to do with truth. Let's just talk about right. No, influencing people.
It's about success, right? I mean, they don't have, the Greeks don't quite have that word, but it is that about that, right?
Yeah.
Becoming wealthy and powerful through persuading the assembly, right? And that's what they can teach you to do, and they do that by really inventing rhetoric, right? So one of the things that's interesting here is that philosophy and rhetoric kind of grew up next door to each other in ancient Greece, right? They invent rhetoric. They come up with modes of persuasion that are really fascinating, and in fact, even today, their modes of persuasion kind of hold true. Like that is, they knew that if you wanted to say, get people to do things, to vote a certain way, right? That what the best thing to do, you could maybe use a little bit of logical argument, but the best thing to do was to excite their passions.
Yeah.
And they taught you, what they would do is they teach you how to excite the different passions depending on what you wanted to do. Isn't it interesting?
Yeah. Yeah, everything they're doing back then, they're still doing today. So, or at least in political speech, right?
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. So that was kind of their approach. One of the things that was important about this approach, though, was that it was only oriented towards victory, not truth, as you indicated earlier, right?
Yeah, because they used to they would stand up and they would argue and they would get everybody on their side, and then they'd argue the opposite just to get everybody on their side to kind of show their prowess, you know?
Sure. So yeah, that was one way of demonstrating, right, their their excellence at persuasion and argument. Was this, they had a doctrine about this, which is interesting, that that reason can support both sides of a contradiction, right? Equally. That's important.
Equally,
equally supports both sides of contradiction. What does that indicate? Well, that's a big deal, because a contradiction, when you have a strict contradiction, you've got truth on one side and falsehood on the other, right?
Yeah.
Which means that if they're correct, that reason equally supports truth and falsehood, right?
Right. Yeah, my coffee is both hot and cold at the same time.
Yeah, exactly.
And reason can support both of those.
That's right.
What?
That's right. Yeah. So, and they would try to show it by arguing both sides, right? Sometimes, right? So that means, of course, that several things follow from that. One is that reason can never get to the truth in itself, right? That is, can never get to what's just in itself. So if you think about, maybe the assembly arguing about whether or not it's just to go to war with Sparta and begin the Peloponnesian Wars, right? We can never really know whether it's just or unjust. We can never really get to the just, like what's just in itself here. All we can do is get to appearances, right? Yeah. And so the truth is what seems to be to you, and the truth is what seems to be to me. So truth is no longer about being, right? Strictly, it's about appearance and seems to be, right? Which is an early form of relativism.
Sure.
Protagoras, one of the important sophists, put it this way: is that man is the measure of all things, of things that are, that they are, things that are not, that they are not, right? And so man becomes the measure, right? It's a pretty relativist, approach to truth. So that's important, because in understanding Socrates, because many of Socrates' interlocutors in the dialogues are actually sophists, or people who have studied with the sophist, right? So the students of sophists who have become powerful politicians. So one of the things that's actually going on in the early dialogues here is there's really a kind of a clash between this group of rhetoricians and relativists and Socrates, right? Who is always showing them that they don't know what they're talking about, right? He applies a very different method, right?
And that's what most people, if they know anything about Socrates, or they've had a professor or something like that knows Socrates or his philosophy, they know the Socratic method, right? So that's his big. That's what kind of a lot of people understand. So what's kind of the basic the basic understanding of kind of the Socratic method?
Sure. So the Socratic method is it's unlike rhetoric, okay? Unlike sophistic rhetoric, I'll put it that way.
Yeah.
It's ordered towards the truth, right? And just the truth. And one of the things you notice in the Socratic method is that the person who's using it, so Socrates, right, doesn't propose definitions himself, right? He doesn't develop complicated doctrines. He doesn't give you a speech, right? For the most part. Occasionally he'll give a speech, but they're few and far between. He usually reacts to someone else, right, proposing a thesis, right? So he'll ask a question. So one of my favorite dialogues is the Gorgias, right?
Yeah.
Gorgias is himself a sophist, and Socrates, says instead of, when he first meets Gorgias, they want, oh, give us a display of your wisdom. Socrates, I just have a question, right? And it's if you ever heard about the Detective Columbo from an old TV show, right? But
Yeah.
He's always asking questions, right? Well, that's Socrates, right? Socrates starts with a question. So he asks Gorgias, says, Gorgias, you're very famous and reputed to be wise, and many want to be your student. Can you tell me, what is it that you teach, right? So just, what is it you teach? And he teaches, he says, oh, I teach, how to become a better man. Oh, wow, that's wonderful, right? What more would you want to know than how to become a better man? Could you tell me, Gorgias, what does it mean to be better, right?
Yeah.
And what is it, that kind of thing, right? So he's inviting his interlocutor to form a definition, right? Or he could say a hypothesis. And then what he does is he takes that definition and explores it, pokes at it, asks questions about it, right? Looks at implications, and eventually his interlocutor finds out, actually, that's not a very good definition, right? I'm not sure about that, right? And he has to revise his definition. Now, this is actually a very important lesson, I think, because one of the things it should teach us, the Socratic method, is that when you make a judgment, and we all make judgments, okay, about anything in ethics, we make judgments, or politics, we make judgments about, right? This is reasonable, this is not reasonable. This is, you should get the vaccine, COVID vaccine, you should not get the COVID vaccine. Both of those, right, are judgments about what should or should not be done. They're judgments about the good, right? Anytime you're dealing with that. Or say, questions about racial justice and, police methods and so forth like that, that we went through recently. There's judgments there about what should or should not be done, about what is just, right?
Right.
And so if you have a strong view about what's just or about something being unjust, that presupposes what? That what is just.
Yeah. You have a definition of justice that you're working from.
That's right. Exactly.
To be the standard of justice, right?
That's right. Absolutely. That's so important. And when we're arguing with people, I would say, and or if you prefer dialoguing, but really arguing, if we're dialoguing, arguing, right? Like say, in an apologetic setting, a good thing to do, right, is just to make your interlocutor define his terms. Yeah. And I mean, that's a great thing to do, right? And if you can, what you'll find often, and this is what Socrates finds often, is that the person literally doesn't know what they're talking about, in the sense that they don't have a clear, consistent understanding of justice or the good.
Yeah, and I like that you use the word consistent there, because if any of our listeners have ever engaged anybody in kind of an apologetic argument, I'm sure you've had the experience, because it's, I think, a fairly common one, where after about 30 minutes in talking in circles, you realize that either his definition, y'all are using the same term, but y'all have completely different definitions, and maybe his keeps changing in the middle of a conversation.
That's right.
And again, like you said, that kind of Socratic questioning, right? Mm-hmm. It really gets them to look at a definition. Is this the definition I'm going to use? Am I applying it consistently?
Right. Yeah.
Am I applying it, appropriately? Like, there's so many different very important factors that really, I think, come to the forefront in that kind of conversation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And it's very effective at sort of, I think, exposing inconsistencies, exposing, sort of arbitrariness, groundless definitions, that sort of thing. Yeah. Now it can seem sometimes that it's annoying, right? because, as Socrates says over and over in the different, especially the early dialogues, I'm not a teacher. I don't teach because I don't know anything, right? He'll say, right? This is ironic, kind of stance. Because, at the end of so many of these, like the Lakeys is all about courage, right? Then there's like, I don't know what courage is, right? It's sort of like, what was the point of this discussion? If what we end in is aporia, we're like, I don't know, right? Well, actually, Socrates, I think, points out two important, in some ways, this process, which he calls dialectic, Plato calls it dialectic as well, can be helpful in two ways. One is kind of like a process of elimination, right? So that when you have a set of hypotheses, say about courage or justice or something like that, well, at least this method is good at detecting error and falsehood, right? So as one author puts it, it helps clear out the intellectual rubbish, right?
Yeah, it's like a little purgatory for your mind.
That's right. That's right. And these are questions about, and Socrates will say, look, these are questions about justice and injustice, about happiness, about human excellence. Okay, he's very clear that getting it wrong about these matters is the worst possible fate, right? Because it impacts your life, it impacts your city, it impacts your family and your friends. So getting rid of error in this area is very helpful, right? One of the Socratic and Platonic ideas about philosophy, right, is that it's medicinal. Right, that is, it's a kind of medicine for the soul. Right, is it getting rid of error? The second thing is, as kind of a process of elimination, it does at least bring you closer to the truth. Because if you're carrying on a process of elimination, a falsification kind of method, right, we're looking to see if a hypothesis can stand. If you do find one that stands, you might not be able to guarantee that it's true, right? But you can say at least it has stood. So Socrates says it's kind of in the vicinity of the truth, right? So in that way, you're at least advancing towards the truth, right? So you're eliminating intellectual rubbish, and you're at least getting closer, right, to the truth.
Right, which completely flies in the face of the Sophists, right?
Right.
And I think one of the other things that like the Socratic method does, if you've ever been on the receiving end, I enjoy it, but it is humbling.
Sure. Yes.
When especially when somebody's smarter than you, asks you questions like, "What do you mean by that?" Like you're like, "All right, well, this guy I know has something in mind," but at the same time, like an intellectual pursuit of truth, it should be humbling in a way that says, maybe I don't have it the best, maybe I don't have it. Maybe I could have it, maybe I could attain it a little better. Maybe I could understand it, explain it a little better. That's a bit humiliating, which was part of the problem, right, in Socrates' day, because humility was not necessarily a characteristic of the Sophists.
Well, it was also not even a characteristic that I think was prized by Greeks in general. Right? So one point in the Gorgias, Socrates talks about the fact that to engage in this kind of method, you need to have the right kind of character, right? That is, you need to care most about the truth more than your reputation or winning, right? And that's some interlocutors benefit, right, from the Socratic method because they have the right kind of character, right? But some come away from it very angry, okay? And this really sort of sets up, I think, gives us the background for understanding why he's on trial.
Let's talk about the trial.
So he's fine. So with that background in mind, right, he's officially charged with corrupting the youth, right? Interesting charge, right? This is brought forward by two young political leaders in Athens, Anytus and Miletus, and they accuse him of corrupting the youth by being an atheist and by teaching false gods, which of course these are contradictory claims. You can't be an atheist and teach foreign gods.
False gods.
I mean, it was foreign gods, not false gods, foreign gods. But so that doesn't make any sense. And Socrates pretty quickly dispenses with all the basic accusations by just appealing to his testimony, right? He could say, look, you guys have seen me in operation. I don't teach. I don't have a doctrine, right, that I propose, right? So this doesn't make any sense. I never teach anything about the gods because I don't know about the gods, right? So, I mean, and this is a really clever defense on his part, and it's kind of unassailable because he doesn't, in those early dialogues, teach, right? He just asks questions, right? So it's hard to pin him down on heresy if he doesn't ever, you know what I mean? Holding a thesis or proposing a thesis. But you know, he exposes pretty quickly that this trial is not about corrupting the youth. It's not about any of these particular charges. It's really about something else altogether, and it ties into that point about humility and being humiliated.
Yeah.
So he says, now I will say this: in the trial, it's pretty clear that Socrates doesn't care too much about what happens to him.
He knows what's going to happen. Yeah.
I think he kind of knows what's going to happen. And so I think he's kind of like resigned to his fate. But he's like, I'm going to make a good show of it. Right. And so he, you know, he says the real reason that I'm being put on trial is because I possess a certain kind of wisdom, a human wisdom, right? Which is really interesting because throughout the whole of his career before this, he says, I'm not wise, right?
I'm not
now
wise,
he says, oh, no, you know, actually, it's a kind of human wisdom I possess. And of course, you know, this is one of the places in the Apology, that's the actual text we have about the trial, you know, where the jury starts to yell and shout, and he says, no, gentlemen,
don't interrupt me.
Don't interrupt. It's my turn. And so he says, now, how do I know this, right? That I have a certain kind of human wisdom. Well, my good friend Caraphon went to the oracle at Delphi and asked the god of the temple, who is whether or not anyone is wiser than Socrates. And the god of the temple, as it would have been Apollo, through the oracle of Delphi said, no one is wiser than Socrates. So not only is he being actually persecuted because he has a kind of human wisdom, it's verified by a god, right?
Right.
You know?
Who apparently he doesn't believe in. So
that's right. The truth.
Beautiful.
And you know, of course, again, this sounds outrageously arrogant to the jury.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And I think it's meant to be honest. But he goes through, but he explains it in this way, and this helps explain, I think, a lot of his Socratic method. He says that he didn't believe this report, right?
Yeah.
Like he said, this can't be true. The god must be mistaken, right? Or there's some kind of riddle here. And often the oracle at Delphi did speak in riddles, so it wasn't impious to think that there's something ironic or whatever here. And so he says, okay, well, I'm going to demonstrate that the god is wrong by going to those in the city who are most reputed to be wise. And I will ask them questions about wisdom, and they will demonstrate their wisdom. And then I'll show that someone is wiser than Socrates, right? See how that works, Mr. Work, right?
Yeah.
So he goes into the city and he finds somebody who's reputed to be wise and begins to question him. And he finds out that this man is not wise. Actually, he's ignorant about what constitutes human excellence. And not only is he ignorant of it, but he won't give up the belief that he's wise about it, right?
Yeah.
So he's in the worst position, right? He's ignorant and he thinks he knows, right? Which is the worst position, because then he's going to act on his what he thinks he knows about justice or happiness, but it's going to be misguided. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, ignorance and arrogance. Yeah,
that's right. Yeah, tied together.
It's a horrible cocktail.
That's right. And so, of course, the man goes away angry, right?
Yeah.
And those that were listening go away. Many of them go away angry. And Socrates says, "Well, you know, I don't know what to do about the anger, but this is mysterious. It seems that I am wiser than this man, at least in this, that I know that I am not wise." That I don't have the techne or the knowledge of the best life or happiness, but that I should be pursuing the question, right? But that my wisdom is a kind of negative wisdom in that sense. Isn't that interesting, right?
Yeah, which all the others didn't show that they had at least enough knowledge to say, here are the things that I don't know.
That's right. Exactly. Yeah. So he goes on with this mission, right? And this is, you know, basically like the Blues Brothers or whatever, like he's on a mission from Apollo, right?
Yeah.
He's on a mission from God, right? A God. He's on this mission, right, to prove that someone's wiser than him. But through his career, he finds actually that no, right? Like that all of his interlocutors lack wisdom, right? And so that the sense in which he's the wisest is that he at least acknowledges his lack of wisdom, right? So he is actually kind of, I think, trying to teach in an indirect way, a kind of intellectual humility.
Yeah.
Right.
But it's I don't want to say it's like a prerequisite, but I mean, it's like this, it's just kind of the disposition, right? That I think every philosopher needs to begin with.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Sure.
I mean, I think that's, maybe that's a good way to put it. I don't know.
I know. I like that, Jason. That's good. I think every philosopher, every student of theology, if you're really going to learn anything, right, you really need to start with a position of intellectual humility, a position which you say, oh, maybe I know a little about this or that, but I don't, I have a lot to learn, right? And also, importantly, that I could be mistaken, right, about things, right? And, you need to know your limitations. I think one of the things you learn over the course of a career, over the course of a life, especially if you're engaged in study and learning, is the further you go, for many of us anyways, the more likely you are to start saying, well, that's probably true, right? Because you realize, how complicated things can be. That doesn't mean that there aren't any absolutes, of course. I think that there are. But
and we have plenty of podcasts on those.
That's right. That's right. But at the same time, I think just from in terms of your own learning, your own study, it's good to have that sort of strain of humility and revisability. Later in the dialogue, this is Socrates poses the question, well, what if they were to let him off if he'd stopped doing philosophy, right? Yeah. Or shouldn't he feel ashamed about being brought to this impasse in his life? And he says, far from it, right? I'm committed to this form of life. I'm not at the least ashamed of it. In fact, this life is valuable because it is the greatest service to the city. So again, Socrates is again like pushing right on his accusers. He's saying, far from corrupting the youth, right? Yeah. I am actually benefiting the city more than any other citizen, right?
Which and you got to remember, he's talking to the sovereign assembly, or he's talking to the people who think that they are the ones that are really at the service.
That's right. Yes,
and Socrates just put himself a little bit up there.
That's right. So I'm gonna. I know this is bad podcasting, but I'm gonna do it anyways. I need to read a little passage here from the Apology, where he, insists, right, that, and this is interesting, that his mission, and so more broadly, philosophy, is the most beneficial thing to the city. Right.
Yeah.
So by city, you want to think of that almost as kind of as a metaphor for political life, but take political life in a broad sense, right? Certainly including laws and government, but also just sort of our culture, our ethos, how we interact with each other, that sort of thing, right? Okay. So he says, gentlemen of the jury, I am grateful and I am your friend, but I will obey the God rather than you as long as I draw breath and am able. I shall not cease to practice philosophy, to exhort you, and in my usual way, to point out to any one of you whom I happen to meet. Good sir, you are an Athenian, a citizen of the greatest city with the greatest reputation for both wisdom and power. Are you not ashamed of your eagerness to possess as much wealth, reputation, and honors as possible, while you do not care nor give thought to wisdom or truth or the best possible state of your soul? Then if one of you disputes this and says he does care, I shall not let him go at once or leave him, but I shall question him, examine him, and test him. And if I do not think he has attained the goodness that he says he has, I shall reproach him, because he attaches little importance to the most important things and greater importance to inferior things. I shall treat in this way anyone I happen to meet, young and old, citizen and stranger, and more so the citizens, because you are more kindred to me. Be sure of this, Be sure that this is what the God orders me to do. And I think there is no greater blessing for the city than my service to the God. For I go around doing nothing but persuading both young and old among you not to care for your body or wealth in preference to, or as strongly as the best possible state of your soul. As I say to you, wealth does not bring about excellence, but excellence brings about wealth and all other public, private, and private blessings for men. So really, I mean, it's I think a nice passage, right, where you get sort of, I mean, that's about one of the longest speeches that Socrates gives, where you get sort of like, okay, this is what he's really up to. It's interesting, right? Then he's saying that criticizing the ignorance, avarice, greed, and ambition, exposing, I guess I should say, right, of the leading elements in society is what's most beneficial, right? That it's a blessing for the city. And that by doing this, he has actually served the city well. Towards the end, after he's found guilty, of course, there's a sentencing phase, and they ask him what sentence he thinks he deserves. And he says, well, if you're going to talk about what I deserve, I think I should receive a pension. And maybe a little place to live, or something like that, of course he knows he's going to die. But that's an interesting claim, right, about it being a blessing to the city. Because certainly that's not what his peers thought, right? And I think it does raise an interesting question about the relationship of philosophy and politics or political community, maybe philosophy and power. That there is something about the pursuit, you think about the pursuit of wisdom, asking questions, making arguments, that, I was raised just long enough ago that where there was this idea that still that all speech should be free, argument should, you should be able to say whatever you want, right? As long as you don't sort of physically attack someone, right? You should be able to put out whatever kind of arguments you want. Somebody like John Stuart Mill, argued vociferously, on the side of, that free speech is the best thing for us, right? Because it allows the truth, right, to emerge, right, from argument. The old classic liberal limit on that was the idea that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater, right? That kind of thing. But other than that, right, you should be free to argue whatever you want, right? I remember when I first got into academics, there was academic freedom, right? It was a high ideal, right? That is, professors should be able to think and say what they want, because that serves the interest of truth. See that, right? And today we don't have that. In the same way, right? We have power prevents us from saying things that we might otherwise say, right? And that's interesting. You think about our political existence, our existence in this culture, in this time and place, is such that if you were to truly follow philosophy, right, you would say things that would probably ruin your career and ruin your opportunities to be prosperous, right? Isn't that interesting? So, I mean, that there maybe is some sort of tension here between political life, living together, living under a government, living in a place of laws. I'm not saying it's necessary, but it does just seem to be true, right? That there's a tension between the full, sort of zealous pursuit of truth, and political life. What do you think about that, Jason?
Yeah, I think that's spot on. The subjugation of everything to politics is going to lead to our destruction, to put it mildly. I think a good example of this is just this past week. I think it was on the 8th or something like that. There was a professor in Portland, Peter Boheisen or something. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right.
I know you're talking about.
At Portland State University, he resigned. He was a philosophy professor there, but he resigned because he said, students are not being taught to think; they're being trained to mimic moral ideologies.
Right.
And
Yeah.
I love. I like that. Well, I mean, I don't like that, but I like how
Sure.
he characterized it,
Yeah.
because again, and this goes also to education, and especially if the secular person thinks of education as forming the best possible citizens for the society, right? But our education seems to be simply training people to mimic moral ideologies,
Right.
as opposed to
Sure.
thinking. So I mean,
So thinking critically,
yeah. Whereas Socrates would say, we want people to be able to think, to process, to be able to enter into different positions, and find value or find defect.
Sure. Sure.
But the idea that I think, again, we're, like you said, we're it's a scary situation where all of us, I think, have had the thought, I want to say this in the public square, but I know that if I say that,
right,
I will be put on trial like Socrates, right? I may not be put to death physically, but like some people, their entire life gets canceled or whatever for simply saying something contrary or asking a question.
Sure. Yeah, that's the thing, is it ought to at least be the case so you can ask the questions, and you look at the things that he marks out here, right? He talks about the body, about wealth, right? About power.
Yeah.
So one of the things I think that he's kind of pulling back on here is that this is kind of an Augustinian point, right? Where is your love, right?
Yeah.
If your love is centered on wisdom and truth, right, then you're going to be kind of pursuing that Socratic path, right?
Yeah.
But if your love is going to be set, or your heart is set on your body, pleasure, wealth, prestige, right, then the pursuit of wisdom is always going to have to be secondary, right? In terms of and worth sacrificing if it gets in the way, right? And that's what happens really with Socrates, is he gets in the way, right?
Yeah.
He gets in the way of normal life because he makes these arguments that show that these sort of commonly accepted things are not actually that valuable, right? And that that those who pursue them are actually ignorant, right? And people who don't like that, right? But it shows you, right, there's a clash of love, right, of objectives there that underlies that tension. And I think it's a tension probably throughout human history, but at the same time is maybe felt in his time in a special way and felt in our time in a particular way.
Yeah, and I think like you said, there's this tension between philosophy and politics. It's when you start to, or at least today, when you start to manipulate language, right? It even becomes difficult, or manipulate language in the way that we have, where we're manipulating the signs and trying to manipulate the realities. Like, it's just
sure.
It's a bad path forward, and it leads to actually, a very difficult way to talk, to dialogue about these things in any serious manner. That's kind of, without emotion, right?
Yeah,
we're gonna that we both have the, and again, this goes back to kind of what you were saying about the power, and kind of even what the sovereign assembly, how they saw it, right? And the Sophists, right? The goal is winning.
That's right. Yeah.
Right. The goal is power. Whereas, right. Whereas, the Christian should be, well, the goal is truth. The goal is God. The goal is holiness. Right. To have these two, clash of titans, if you want.
Yeah.
It creates a disturbing society.
Yeah.
So.
And I think, in a lot of ways that is that is kind of like part of the human condition, right? Is that, you're either going to be this is one of the things that's interesting about the Socratic and Platonic tradition, is there is a kind of dramatic way in which they paint the human condition, right? Which is this kind of real opposition, right? There's it kind of makes you in a different sort of setting. Think of the city of God and the city of man. There is the lover of wisdom and everybody else, right?
Yeah.
And if you're everybody else, maybe you won't be pure, like maybe you won't be, wretchedly evil, but maybe you will be. But the point being is you're not going to be ruled by the love of truth, right?
Right.
You're not going to be ruled by the love of reality, the love of trying to know what is just in itself, right? And so you fall back on this opposite view. I think that's part of that paints it a little bit of a dark kind of picture, or at least a picture of conflict and kind of spiritual war. And I think Socrates was willing to see it in that way. Two quick things here as we just wrap up that I think illustrate this conflict. That's really the Socratic, the trial and death of Socrates is revealing, right? There is this conflict between these. Is two statements by Socrates. One is that philosophy is preparation for death. And more than a few undergraduate students may have thought that's absolutely true as they're taking an introduction to philosophy class. But what he means there is detachment, right? Is you learn to be detached from these things that other people consider to be the most important, right?
Yeah, power, wealth, all those.
Yeah. The other is, is really his death scene, right? It's a really moving scene. It's it's in the Credo, and there we have, Socrates has an opportunity. He's sentenced to death, but they give him the nicest death penalty that Athens had, which was to drink a poison that basically just puts you to sleep. Again, among execution methods in Athens, that was the best, right? and actually they let him have his friends with him, so they're interested in killing him, but they're not. It's interesting. They kind of give him the nicest situation in which to die, right?
Almost as if they know what they're doing is
wrong.
It's wrong.
So they have this famous dialogue here right before he's supposed to die, right? I mean, it's like an hour before he's supposed to die, right?
Yeah.
And they're arguing about the existence of the soul and the immortality of the soul. And Socrates goes through and disproves all of the arguments of the immortality of the soul, right? and of course, his friends are like frustrated because they want to believe their friend is going to continue to, like, his soul is going to carry on, right? And one of them starts weeping and he reprimands them. And Socrates is perfectly calm through the whole thing. He does say, I think it's best to believe that the soul continues and to live as if it does. But then he eventually drinks the poison and he's starting to die. And the last one of the, I think, if not the last statement, close to the last statement he makes is, he reminds one of his friends to make a sacrifice to the god Asclepius. And the god Asclepius, interestingly, is the god of healing. Yeah. And it's like he's saying we should make a sacrifice of gratitude to the god of healing. But he's dying. Right? And again, this is one of those last little ironic, weird things that Socrates leaves us with. We don't know for sure what he meant by that, but there is a pretty broad consensus among scholars that what he meant by that was that death is a kind of healing, right? Which is an interesting and kind of provocative thought there. Obviously, for the most part, we want to avoid death. We don't think about death in that way. Sure. But I think, if you see the world as involved in this conflict, right, in which the pursuit of truth and wisdom can lead to your death, right? Because there's this opposing force, right, of the pursuit of wealth and prestige and power. Then really, to use an old Catholic phrase, it's a veil of tears, right? And to be freed from it is not the worst thing, right? By far. So it's interesting, I think, picture of both the human condition of the pursuit of wisdom that Socrates' trial and death gives to us. Yeah.
I mean, I think it gives us great lessons that are, again, you're talking, what is that, 2,400 years ago?
Yeah.
2,500 years ago. But I mean, he was the first dude that gets canceled and put to death for what he said, for just asking questions. Like, what he went through is still very important for us today. And we can draw on, I think, many of these same great lessons from Socrates.
Sure.
If we take the time to look into it, to read it, and really try to I think, and I think in today's society, we have to make that concerted effort to say, I'm going to put truth first. I'm going to put
That's right.
these
That's
higher
key.
things before wealth, prestige, and power, and all these other things.
Yeah, I think
So Socrates, I think, gives us that disposition that we should have. All right, Dr. Smith, I think you've given our listeners a lot to think about. We'll put a note in the links down below to you can read the Apology of Socrates, which has his trial and all of these wonderful things in there. In the meantime, check out all of our content over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. We'll see you next time. God bless.